You will heed my command, or face the consequences.
The amphitheater of Sovereign's Rest had witnessed coronations, executions, and treaty signings that reshaped the borders of civilized space, but never had it contained this particular flavor of chaos. Lieutenant Brennan Cole stood in his gray detention uniform, wrists bound in gossamer steel that hummed with a frequency just high enough to make his teeth ache, and tried to calculate exactly how he'd ended up as the galaxy's most uncomfortable party decoration. Around him, the representatives of 100 civilizations jostled for position on the tiered platforms that rose like metallic petals around the central arena. The Krell delegation occupied the highest tier, their exoskeletons gleaming under lights that pulsed in rhythm with the station's quantum core. Below them, the Valorian Empire had claimed an entire section, their prince's four arms spread wide in a gesture that Brennan's cultural briefings had labeled as either supreme confidence or mild indigestion. The translation algorithms were notoriously imprecise with Valorian body language. His Thalian guard, a 7-foot creature whose name contained sounds human vocal cords couldn't reproduce, had introduced himself as something that sounded like rocks grinding in a disposal unit. Brennan had settled on calling him Gary, which the guard had accepted with what might have been amusement or profound offense. It was hard to tell with a species whose faces looked like someone had started sculpting granite and given up halfway through. "This is taking forever," Brennan muttered. "Do all your ceremonies run on geological timescales? Or is this special?" Gary's translator chip rendered his response in flat, mechanical tones. "Silence is traditional for prisoners." "Yeah, but I'm really more of a guest, right? An involuntary guest. A guest who happened to be on the wrong side of a border dispute and definitely didn't sign up for whatever this is." The amphitheater's ambient noise, a symphony of clicks, hums, whistles, and languages that predated human spaceflight by millennia, suddenly dropped to silence. Brennan felt it like a pressure change before a storm. Every being in the chamber turned their attention, or sensory apparatus, or consciousness cluster, toward the royal dais. Queen Mirith Selene emerged from the shadows at the top of the 700 steps, and Brennan understood immediately why delegations had traveled across the galaxy for this moment. Her blue skin seemed to generate its own luminescence. Patterns of bioluminescent cells tracing lines across her arms and face, in designs that shifted with each movement. Her elongated ears, rising to elegant points that extended past the crown of her head, caught the light and bent it into prismatic fragments. The ceremonial robes she wore appeared to be woven from captured starlight itself, flowing around her form like liquid silver. "Well," Brennan whispered to Gary, "I'm starting to see why everyone brought their A game." The presentations began with the Krell Emperor, whose offering involved a demonstration of quantum crystals that actually sang, with harmonics that made the air vibrate. Each crystal contained, according to the translator's breathless narration, the compressed light of a dying star. Brennan watched as the Emperor's mandibles clicked through what was probably a very moving speech about unity and prosperity and whatever else you said when you were trying to marry the most powerful woman in known space. The Valorian prince followed, and Brennan had to admit the living fleet demonstration was impressive. Thousands of biomechanical ships, each no larger than his fist, swarmed through the amphitheater in synchronized patterns that formed images. The prince and queen united, their hypothetical offspring, a galaxy at peace under their combined rule. It was propaganda as performance art, and the crowd ate it up. The merchant princes of Andros took a more direct approach, simply displaying the raw wealth they'd accumulated. The anti-gravity platforms they wheeled in groaned under the weight of precious metals, rare elements, and crystallized exotic matter. One of the platforms held what Brennan's guard helpfully identified as enough processed uranium to power a small colony for a century. "Or destroy one," Gary added. "Depends on application." "You Thalians really know how to look on the bright side," Brennan said. For 3 hours the parade continued. Each civilization attempted to outdo the last, turning the ceremony into a bizarre auction where the prize was a marriage alliance and the currency was everything from military might to cultural treasures to promises of technological sharing. Brennan's feet hurt, his wrists hurt. The Gossamer Steel had apparently decided that humming wasn't enough and had graduated to a low-grade vibration that was working its way up his arms. "How much longer?" he asked Gary. "Until the Queen decides. Could be hours more, could be days." In the year 2847, selection lasted 3 weeks. "Please tell me you're joking." Thalians do not joke. We find humor to be an inefficient use of cognitive resources. "Gary, buddy, you're missing out on one of the best parts of being alive." The Chancellor of the Trade Confederacy was mid-presentation, his crystalline face refracting the amphitheater's lights into 1,000 dancing fragments, when something changed. Brennan felt it before he understood it. A shift in the quantum hum that permeated the station, a subtle alteration in the air pressure, a collective intake of breath from 100 species. Queen Myrith Solane stood. The Chancellor stopped speaking mid-word, his voice cutting off so abruptly that the silence felt like a physical presence. Standing at a selection was, Gary's suddenly rigid posture suggested, not part of the traditional protocol. She began to descend the 700 steps of the royal dais. Brennan watched her approach and felt a growing sense of cosmic dread, the kind that came from recognizing that the universe had a sense of humor, and you were about to become the punchline. She walked past the Krell Emperor, whose mandibles began clicking in what the translator rendered as several highly improper words. She walked past the Valorian prince, whose forearms dropped to his sides in a gesture that definitely meant shock this time. She walked past Chancellor Vex, whose crystalline face developed a crack that spread across his forehead with an audible snap. She stopped directly in front of Brennan Cole. Up close, she was even more striking. Her eyes were dark enough to hold entire nebulae, and her elongated ears tilted forward in a gesture he couldn't interpret but suspected was significant. When she spoke, her voice carried across the amphitheater with unnatural clarity, as if the station itself was amplifying her words. This one, Brennan's brain, which had survived combat, diplomatic incidents, and one memorable shore leave on a station with variable gravity, finally decided it had had enough and offered only one thought. "You have got to be kidding me." 3 heartbeats of absolute silence passed before the amphitheater exploded into noise that made Brennan's earlier complaint about geological timescales seem quaint. The Krell Emperor's translator produced a stream of sounds that Brennan's own chip refused to translate, simply displaying a warning symbol that looked distressingly like a biohazard sign. The Valorian prince's forearms began gesturing in patterns so rapid and complex that they blurred together, creating what appeared to be a physical manifestation of outrage. Gary's granite features somehow managed to convey profound confusion. "This is unprecedented." "Yeah, I'm getting that impression," Brennan said, trying very hard to keep his voice steady. "Any chance she's pointing at someone behind me?" "You are against a wall." "Right, stupid question." The Queen's dark eyes met his, and Brennan saw something flicker there that might have been amusement. Her elongated ears tilted slightly forward, and he made a mental note to figure out what that gesture meant, assuming he survived long enough for it to matter. Royal guards materialized from positions he hadn't even noticed, forming a ceremonial circle around him that was probably meant to be protective, but felt uncomfortably like a cage. Chancellor Vex of the Trade Confederacy stepped forward, his cracked, crystalline face refracting light in jagged patterns. His voice came through the translator with an edge that suggested the machine was struggling to convey the full weight of his diplomatic fury. "Your Majesty, the protocols of selection require that you choose from among the assembled suitors. This specimen was brought as a cultural exhibit, not a candidate." "I am aware of what he was brought as," Queen Myrith said, her voice carrying that same unnatural clarity. "I am also aware that the protocols state I may choose any being present in this amphitheater who has reached their species' age of maturity." Lieutenant Cole qualifies. "The human species lost the third border conflict," the Valorian prince said, his forearms settling into a position that Brennan's cultural database labeled as formal challenge. "They have no standing in galactic politics, no significant military, no economic power. Choosing one of them is an insult to every delegation present." Brennan decided this was probably not the moment to mention that the third border conflict had been lost primarily because humanity's first attempt at faster-than-light diplomacy had involved accidentally parking a colony ship in what turned out to be a Valorian sacred breeding ground. The war had lasted 6 weeks, which was approximately 5 weeks and 6 days longer than humanity's military had remained combat effective against species who'd been perfecting warfare since Earth was still cooling. "I choose who I choose," the Queen said, and something in her tone made it clear the discussion was over. She turned and began walking back toward the royal dais, her starlight robes flowing behind her. The guards tightened their circle around Brennan and began moving him toward a side exit. "Wait," Brennan said, finding his voice finally. "Don't I get a say in this?" The Queen paused on the 7th step and looked back over her shoulder. "Do you object to the selection?" Brennan opened his mouth, closed it, and tried to figure out how to express that. While he definitely objected to being a political pawn in some cosmic game he didn't understand, he was also very aware that objecting might result in him being sent back to the detention facility where the food tasted like recycled plastic, and the other prisoners had stopped being surprised when guards occasionally forgot to activate the atmospheric shields. "I'm just trying to understand what's happening." "You'll be briefed," she said, and continued climbing. Gary leaned close as they moved through the exit corridor, his voice dropping to a rumble that the translator rendered as almost confidential. "For what it's worth, human, I have served the Queen for 40 years. She has never acted without purpose. That's either very comforting or absolutely terrifying, and I haven't decided which." The corridors of Sovereign's Rest were unlike anything Brennan had seen during his time in detention. The walls appeared to be living metal, pulsing with light that flowed like water through channels he couldn't quite focus on. The artificial gravity shifted subtly with each intersection, and twice they passed through what his inner ear insisted were impossible angles. The other guards, there were 6 of them now, representing 4 different species, maintained a careful distance, their weapons held in what he'd learned to recognize as the ready but not actively threatening position. They stopped before a door that Iris opened to reveal quarters that could have housed his entire former crew, with room left over for a small recreational facility. The walls displayed real-time feeds of the nebula outside, creating the illusion that he was standing in open space. Furniture that appeared to be grown rather than built rose from the floor in organic curves. The sleeping platform looked like it could comfortably accommodate someone twice his size. "These are your quarters," Gary said. "You will remain here until summoned." "Summoned for what exactly?" "Orientation, cultural briefing, survival training." Brennan turned to look at his guard. "That last one was a joke, right? You said Thalians don't joke." "I did not joke." Gary's translator somehow managed to convey absolute sincerity. 17 members of the royal household have already requested permission to challenge your presence. Captain Thera has denied all requests, but accommodation attempts through unofficial channels are statistically probable. You're telling me someone's going to try to kill me. Several someones, almost certainly. The Queen's choice has disrupted political alliances that have stood for centuries. You represent chaos to a system that values stability above almost all else. Gary's granite features shifted into what might have been sympathy. I have been assigned as your primary security. I will attempt to keep you alive. I feel so much better now. I am glad I could provide comfort. Gary turned to leave, then paused. Human Brennan, a question. When the Queen stood before you, you did not show appropriate deference. You made what my cultural files indicate was a humorous observation. Why? Brennan thought about it. Because I was terrified. And when I'm terrified, I make jokes. It's either that or panic, and panic's never been particularly useful. The Thalian's translator was silent for a long moment. I am beginning to understand why she chose you. Then he was gone, and the door irised shut, leaving Brennan alone in quarters designed for someone far more important than a failed lieutenant from a species that most of the galaxy considered a minor curiosity. He walked to the wall display and stared out at the nebula, watching clouds of ionized gas drift in patterns that would take centuries to complete. Somewhere out there, humanity's few remaining colonies were probably receiving news of the selection. He wondered what they'd think, knowing that one of their own had somehow become the center of galactic politics through no particular merit or intention. A soft chime indicated an incoming message. The wall beside the display shimmered and resolved into the face of someone new, a being whose features suggested several species mixed together in ways that shouldn't have been biologically possible, but somehow worked. The translator identified them as Thalian-Androsian hybrid, diplomatic attaché, clearance level 7. Lieutenant Cole, I am Kel. I have been assigned to prepare you for your new role. We should begin immediately. Your life expectancy without proper education is approximately 72 hours. Does everyone around here lead with the death threats? Or is that just how you make friends? Kel's face did something that might have been a smile. I like you already. That will make the briefings more enjoyable. Please sit. We have much to discuss in very little time. Brennan woke on the third morning in his palatial quarters to discover that his food taster had quit. The resignation notice appeared on the wall display in 17 languages simultaneously, which Kel later explained was the Sovereign's rest equivalent of burning your bridges with exceptional thoroughness. Jirix was from the Methros colony, Kel said, examining the message with what appeared to be academic interest. They have 63 distinct words for different types of poison. The fact that he quit suggests he identified at least 40 of them in your food supply over the past 2 days. Brennan looked at the breakfast spread that had materialized on the table while he slept, courtesy of whatever automated systems ran the palace. The pastries looked innocent enough, filled with what the menu claimed was Valorian cream fruit. So I shouldn't eat this. Oh no, you should definitely eat it. Jirix's successor arrives in an hour, and you'll want to demonstrate confidence in the palace security systems. Kel's hybrid features arranged themselves into an expression that Brennan had learned meant he was about to say something he found personally amusing. Also, Captain Thera already scanned everything. The poison was in yesterday's dinner, which you didn't eat because you were too busy reading the cultural briefings I assigned. The briefings that were 3,000 pages long. I edited them down from the full 12,000. You're welcome. Kel settled into one of the chairs that seemed to grow from the floor itself, his posture suggesting he planned to stay a while. Today we're covering the palace's power structure, which means understanding who wants you dead and why. It's a surprisingly complex topic. Over the next hour, while Brennan ate breakfast that he only mostly trusted, Kel laid out a political landscape that made the third border conflict look like a minor disagreement over parking spaces. The Palace of Sovereign's Rest housed not just the Queen and her immediate staff, but representatives from every major galactic faction, each with their own agendas, alliances, and ancestral grudges that predated human civilization. The Valorian delegation occupies the East Spiral, Kel explained, gesturing at a holographic map that materialized above the table. They've been here for 70 years, ever since the Queen took the throne. Their prince, the one with the expressive arms, was 12 years old when he arrived. He spent his entire adult life preparing to marry her. That's not creepy at all. By Valorian standards, it's romantic. By human standards, it's a really long job interview that you just ruined. Kel highlighted another section of the map. The Krell occupy the North Atrium. They reproduce through spore colonies, which means the Emperor you saw is technically made up of 6,000 individual organisms operating as a collective consciousness. Insulting him is insulting 6,000 beings simultaneously, which is impressively efficient. Brennan pushed away his plate and studied the map. The palace was vast beyond comprehension, a hollowed-out asteroid that had been transformed into something between a city and a living organism. Districts devoted to different atmospheric compositions, connected through transition zones. Gravity varied by sector according to species preference. The sky, in some areas, displayed real-time astronomical data, while others projected historical events from civilizations that had risen and fallen before humanity discovered fire. How many people live here? Approximately 800,000, if we're using people loosely to include beings that exist as energy patterns, hive minds, and one species that's technically a sophisticated fungal network. Kel zoomed the map to show a section near what appeared to be the palace core. These are your rooms. Note the strategic placement, far from the main diplomatic quarters, close to the servant passages, and exactly 7 minutes from the nearest emergency evacuation route. Someone put thought into this. Captain Thera puts thought into everything. She's kept the Queen alive through 2 assassination attempts, 4 coup attempts, and one incident with a Krell delegation that got drunk on fermented hydrogen and tried to absorb the throne room. She doesn't like you, but she respects the Queen's judgment enough to keep you breathing. The door irised open and Gary entered, his granite features somehow managing to convey urgency. Human Brennan, your atmospheric regulator has been tampered with. Brennan looked at the small device attached to the wall near his sleeping platform. It was supposed to maintain Earth-standard air composition in his quarters, compensating for the fact that the palace's default atmosphere would give him a splitting headache after about 20 minutes and render him unconscious after an hour. Tampered with how? Someone adjusted it to methane breather specifications. If you had slept normally last night instead of staying awake reading briefings, you would have suffocated around local midnight. Kell and Brennan exchanged glances. So the poisoned food was redundant, Brennan said. Efficiency is not a hallmark of palace assassination attempts, Kell said. Usually multiple factions act independently, which creates redundancy but also increases the chance that at least one attempt succeeds. The fact that you've survived 3 days is either remarkable luck or suggests that someone is deliberately keeping you alive to see what happens next. I really hope it's that second thing. Gary moved to the atmospheric regulator and began running diagnostics with equipment that appeared to grow from his stony fingers. The tampering required access codes that only senior palace staff possess. The list of suspects includes approximately 200 individuals. Fantastic. I feel so much safer. A chime indicated another incoming message. This time the wall display showed Captain Thera, the Queen's personal guard. She was from a species Brennan hadn't encountered before, with features that seemed to shift slightly whenever he tried to focus on them, as if she existed slightly out of phase with normal space-time. Her voice came through the translator as precise and cold. Lieutenant Cole, you are summoned to dinner with Her Majesty. Tonight. Formal dress. The occasion is a diplomatic reception for the Androsian merchant princes, who are exceptionally unhappy about recent events and exceptionally good at hiding weapons in ceremonial garments. Do try not to die. It would create paperwork. The display went dark before Brennan could respond. She has such a warm personality, he said. Kell stood and gestured for Brennan to follow. Come. If you're having dinner with the Queen, we need to accelerate your education. You need to learn which utensils are for eating and which are ceremonial weapons, how to breathe in atmospheres with 17% more nitrogen than you're used to, and most importantly, how to recognize when someone is toasting your health versus subtly threatening your immediate existence. The difference is often just one word in languages you don't speak. Is it too late to go back to the detention facility? Several weeks too late, yes. Kell led him into the corridor where Gary fell into step behind them. But look at the bright side. You're having dinner with the most powerful woman in the galaxy. Most beings would kill for that opportunity. Based on the past 3 days, Brennan said, I'm pretty sure several of them are trying to. The formal reception garments that arrived in Brennan's quarters looked like someone had taken traditional human evening wear and decided it needed to function in 17 different atmospheric conditions simultaneously. The fabric shifted colors based on ambient light, and Kell assured him that the subtle shimmer running through the material was a security feature that would harden into protective armor if someone tried to stab him, which was apparently common enough to warrant mention. The Queen requests your presence in the Royal Observatory before the reception, Kell said, adjusting the garment's collar in a way that made Brennan feel like a child being prepared for his first day of school. This is unprecedented, also terrifying, also possibly the safest you'll be all evening, since the observatory is the most secure location in the palace aside from the throne room itself. You have a real gift for reassurance. I'm told it's my best quality. Gary escorted him through corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves based on some logic Brennan couldn't fathom. Twice they passed through transitional zones where gravity shifted from standard to something that made his stomach lurch. And once they walked through what appeared to be solid wall that turned out to be a holographic security checkpoint. The other beings they encountered, servants, delegates, guards from a dozen species, all stopped and stared with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Am I imagining it, or is everyone looking at me like I'm some kind of exotic disease? You are the most interesting thing to happen to palace politics in 70 years, Gary said. Also, yes, several species do consider humans to be a form of exotic disease. The Krell, for instance, find your reliance on singular consciousness to be deeply unsettling. The Royal Observatory occupied the highest point of the palace, a transparent dome that offered an unobstructed view of the nebula that surrounded Sovereign's Rest. The dome itself was made from something Kell had called frozen quantum foam, which apparently meant it was simultaneously solid and permeable depending on what you wanted to do. The effect was standing in open space while breathing comfortably, watching stellar gases drift in patterns that would outlast civilizations. Queen Mareth stood at the center of the dome, her blue skin seeming to absorb and reflect the nebula's light simultaneously. She wore simpler robes than during the selection, though simple was relative. The fabric still moved like living water, and her elongated ears were adorned with what looked like captured starlight woven into delicate chains. "Lieutenant Cole," she said without turning, "thank you for accepting my invitation. I wasn't aware I could refuse." "You couldn't." She turned to face him, and her dark eyes held that same flicker of amusement he'd seen in the amphitheater. "But I appreciate you pretending you had a choice. It's more polite than most of my visitors manage." Gary and Kell had somehow vanished, leaving Brennan alone with the Queen in a space that felt both infinite and uncomfortably intimate. He decided that if he was going to die in the next few days anyway, he might as well be honest. "Your Majesty, I'm going to be direct because I've never been good at political games, and I'm too tired to start learning now. Why did you choose me? And please don't tell me it's because I happen to be standing in the right place, because we both know that's not true." The Queen's ears tilted forward in that gesture he still couldn't quite interpret. "You surrendered your unit during the Third Border conflict, not because you were losing, though you were, but because continuing to fight would have endangered a civilian transport carrying 8,000 refugees. You gave up your career, your reputation, and your freedom to save people who weren't your responsibility. That was in my military file? Everything is in someone's file if you know where to look." She moved to the edge of the dome, where the illusion of standing in space was most complete. "The Galactic Council has become calcified, Lieutenant. Every faction represented at the selection ceremony represents an existing power structure. The Krell Empire, the Valorian military nobility, the Androsian merchant guilds, all of them are systems built on maintaining control. Choosing any of them would have simply reinforced the status quo." Brennan moved to stand beside her, watching the nebula's slow dance. "So you chose someone with no power at all." "I chose someone who understands that power is a responsibility rather than a trophy." She glanced at him, and for the first time since the selection, he saw something other than the carefully controlled mask of royalty. She looked tired, carrying a weight that even the blue luminescence of her skin couldn't hide. "I've been ruling for 70 years, Lieutenant. Do you know how long that is for my species?" "I'm guessing longer than it sounds. My people typically live 200 years. I took the throne at 25, expecting to rule for perhaps 50 years before abdicating in favor of an heir. But the political situation never stabilized enough to allow succession, and every year I delayed was another year of being seen as a symbol rather than a person. I'm 95 years old and I'm exhausted." The confession hung in the air between them, made more stark by the infinite backdrop of the nebula. Brennan tried to process what she was telling him and found himself defaulting to his usual coping mechanism. "So your solution was to marry a human prisoner of war and see what happens?" To his surprise, she laughed, a genuine sound that transformed her face completely. "When you put it that way, it does sound somewhat reckless. I was going to say insane, but reckless works. You make jokes when you're nervous. Kell mentioned that in his reports. Kell writes reports about me? Everyone writes reports about you. You're currently the most documented person in the palace." She turned to face him fully, her expression settling back into something more formal. "I need you to understand what you represent, Lieutenant. By choosing you, I've forced every faction in the galactic community to recalculate their positions. The Council can't simply dismiss you as irrelevant, not when the Queen has made you her consort select. But neither can they accept you without acknowledging that power structures they've spent centuries building might be less stable than they believed. So I'm a political weapon. You're a catalyst. There's a difference. She moved toward the observatory's exit, then paused. Tonight's reception will be your first public appearance since the selection. The Androsian merchant princes are clever, dangerous, and exceptionally good at appearing harmless. They'll test you, probably subtly, possibly lethally. Captain Thera will be present, but she can only prevent obvious assassination attempts. The subtle ones are your responsibility. Any advice? Be yourself. You survived the third border conflict, military prison, and 3 days in my palace. You're more resilient than you appear. Her ears tilted forward again, and this time Brennan was certain it meant she was pleased. Also, the third course of dinner is traditionally served with ceremonial blades that are fully functional weapons. Try not to accidentally start a war by using the wrong fork. That's very specific advice. I've seen it happen twice. Once was an accident. The other time was deliberate but made to look accidental, which was actually quite impressive from a strategic standpoint. She walked to the exit, her starlight robes flowing behind her. I'll see you at the reception, Lieutenant. Do try to survive it. I'd rather not have to choose another consort. The paperwork alone would be tiresome. Then she was gone, leaving Brennan alone in the observatory with a view of the universe and the growing certainty that he'd somehow become the center of something far larger and more dangerous than he'd imagined. The diplomatic reception took place in the Hall of Convergence, a space so vast that Brennan's eyes couldn't quite accept its dimensions. The ceiling appeared to extend into infinity, displaying what Kell had explained was actual real-time footage of distant galaxies, while the floor was made from something that looked like solidified light. Tables arranged in geometric patterns that probably had political significance hosted delegations from across known space, each group carefully positioned to balance ancient protocols with current power dynamics. Brennan entered beside the Queen, and the ambient noise of several hundred conversations dropped to absolute silence. He'd thought the amphitheater had been intimidating, but that had been theater. This was intimacy, close enough to see the expressions on faces that ranged from humanoid to utterly alien, close enough to hear the whispers that started the moment the initial shock wore off. "Smile," the Queen murmured, her voice pitched for his ears alone. "You're representing your entire species right now. Try to look like humanity deserves a seat at the table." No pressure then, none whatsoever. The Androsian merchant princes occupied the central table, a position that indicated their importance in galactic commerce. They were bipedal, roughly humanoid in proportion, but their skin had the translucent quality of deep-sea creatures, and their eyes were multifaceted like insects. The eldest among them, who Kell had identified as Prince Merchant Varos, rose as the Queen approached, his movements carrying the careful grace of someone accustomed to environments with different gravity. "Your Majesty," Varos said, his voice coming through the translator as smooth and calculating. "You honor us with your presence, and you bring your choice. How delightful." The pause before choice was deliberate, weighted with enough implication to fill a cargo hold. Brennan felt the Queen's hand barely touch his arm, a warning or reassurance, he couldn't tell which. "Prince Merchant Varos, may I present Lieutenant Brennan Cole of the human delegation." Brennan, the Prince Merchant, controls approximately 40% of the antimatter trade in this sector. Offending him would be economically catastrophic. "I'll try to keep my catastrophes to a minimum," Brennan said, and immediately wondered if that counted as offending. Varos's multifaceted eyes fixed on him with the intensity of a merchant evaluating merchandise. "The human has humor. How refreshing. Please join us. We have much to discuss, and the first course has already been served." The meal that followed was an exercise in controlled chaos. Brennan sat between the Queen and a Krell subdelegate, whose name sounded like wind through a cave system, while Gary stood behind him in a position that Kell had called ceremonial guardian, but actually watching for poison and concealed weapons. The food arrived in courses that violated several laws of physics, dishes that generated their own gravity, soups that existed in multiple states of matter simultaneously, and one memorable plate that appeared to be empty until you looked at it from exactly the right angle. "The third course is traditionally served with ceremonial implements," the Queen said quietly, as servants began distributing what looked like elegant knives but felt weighted for combat. Choose the blade with the curved handle. The straight one is for challenging someone to ritual combat. Brennan examined the two nearly identical implements in front of him. And if I pick wrong, then we'll discover how quickly Captain Thera can prevent an interstellar incident. He selected the curved blade and used it to cut into something that the menu claimed was crystallized plasma from a neutron star's corona. It tasted like copper and starlight, assuming starlight had a flavor, which apparently it did. Prince Merchant Varos leaned forward, his translucent skin rippling with colors that Brennan's cultural database unhelpfully labeled as commercial interest, in a language humanity hadn't been aware existed. Lieutenant Cole, I'm curious. Your species has so little to offer in galactic politics. No significant military, no economic power, no technological innovations that weren't borrowed from other civilizations. What do you suppose the Queen sees in humanity that the rest of us have missed? The table had gone quiet again, conversations fading as beings from a dozen species waited to hear how he'd answer. Brennan saw Captain Thera's hand move slightly toward a weapon he couldn't see, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he registered that this was a test, maybe the test. I think, he said carefully, that she appreciates our ability to lose gracefully. We're really good at it. We've had a lot of practice. Several beings at nearby tables made sounds that the translators rendered as laughter. Varos's multifaceted eyes shifted through a spectrum of colors. An interesting answer. Self-deprecation as diplomatic strategy. Bold, if somewhat unconventional. Humans excel at being unconventional, the Queen said, and something in her tone suggested the conversation was over. The meal continued through 7 more courses, each more elaborate than the last. Brennan navigated conversations about trade routes he'd never heard of, political alliances that predated his species' spaceflight, and one lengthy discussion about the proper way to terraform a moon that somehow became an argument about artistic expression versus practical engineering. He contributed when directly addressed and tried to look thoughtful when people, or beings, said things that were probably important, but which he had absolutely no context for understanding. It was during the 9th course, something called temporal gelatin, that allegedly contained flavors from 3 different time periods, that the evening took a turn toward chaos. The lights in the Hall of Convergence flickered once, then died completely, plunging the room into darkness, broken only by the bioluminescent beings scattered throughout the crowd. Gary's hand clamped on Brennan's shoulder with enough force to leave bruises. Do not move! The darkness lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but in that time Brennan heard movement all around him, the whisper of fabric, the click of weapons being readied, and one sound that might have been a blade being drawn, or might have been something breathing very close to his face. When the lights returned, the hall was in disarray. Several delegates had drawn weapons openly. Others had formed defensive clusters around their tables. And Prince Merchant Varos was staring at his chest, where a thin knife, definitely not ceremonial, protruded from his translucent skin, dark fluid spreading around the wound. Well, Varos said, his voice coming through the translator with remarkable calm. This is unexpected. Then he collapsed, and the hall erupted into controlled pandemonium. Guards materialized from positions Brennan hadn't noticed, forming barriers between tables. Captain Thera appeared beside the Queen, weapons visible now, her features still shifting in that unsettling way. Medics rushed toward Varos, their equipment already scanning and analyzing. The Queen stood, her voice cutting through the noise with that same unnatural clarity she'd used in the amphitheater. The reception is concluded. All delegates will return to their quarters. The palace is now under Security Protocol 7. Brennan felt Gary pulling him toward an exit he couldn't see, the Thalian's granite body serving as a mobile barrier. As they moved through the crowd, he caught a glimpse of the Queen's face. She wasn't looking at Varos or the medics or the chaos spreading through the hall. She was looking directly at him, and her elongated ears were tilted in a direction he'd never seen before. Straight back, pressed almost flat against her head. Kell had neglected to mention what that gesture meant, but Brennan was fairly certain it wasn't anything good. The interrogation room was smaller than Brennan expected, which he supposed made sense since intimacy made people nervous and nervous people talked. Captain Thera sat across from him, her shifting features finally settling into something almost stable, while Kel stood near the door looking like someone who'd just watched his favorite theory proven catastrophically correct. Prince Merchant Varos will survive, Thera said without preamble. The blade missed everything vital, which suggests either remarkable incompetence or deliberate intent. Given the level of planning required to orchestrate a blackout in the Hall of Convergence during a diplomatic reception, I'm inclined toward the latter. Brennan had spent the past hour replaying those 5 seconds of darkness, trying to remember anything useful. Someone wanted it to look like an assassination attempt without actually committing assassination. Very astute for someone whose species considers faster-than-light travel to be a recent innovation. Thera's features rippled in what might have been approval. The blade's origin has been traced to Valorian military stock. The blackout was triggered by someone with palace security clearances, and the timing, during your first public appearance, is notable. So someone's trying to frame the Valorians, or frame me, or both. Kel moved away from the door, his hybrid features animated with something approaching excitement. Actually, Lieutenant, I believe someone is trying to prove a point. Consider the variables. An attack dramatic enough to cause concern, but not dramatic enough to actually kill anyone important, executed during the one event where every major faction was present to witness it, and timed specifically to occur while you were sitting at the central table. I'm the point? You're the catalyst, Kel said, just as the Queen intended. The door irised open and Queen Mareth entered, still wearing her reception robes, though the starlight fabric now seemed dimmed, as if it had absorbed too much darkness. Her elongated ears were no longer pressed back but tilted forward in that gesture Brennan had decided meant she was working through a problem. Leave us, she said to Thera and Kel. Your Majesty, protocol suggests, Thera began. Protocol suggests many things. I'm suggesting you leave, now. They left, though Brennan noticed Gary remained stationed outside the door, a granite sentinel who probably heard everything anyway. The Queen sat in the chair Thera had vacated, and for a long moment simply looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the room's harsh lighting in ways that made them seem infinite. You're wondering if you were the target, she said finally. You weren't. The attack was theater, which means it was a message. The question is, message from whom and to whom? I'm really hoping you have theories because I've got nothing. Several theories, actually. The most likely involves a coalition of younger delegates from the Krell, Valorian, and Androsian factions. Beings who see the current power structure as ossified and want change, but lack the political capital to demand it openly. She leaned back, and something in her posture suggested exhaustion. By attacking an Androsian prince merchant during your debut reception, they've created a crisis that forces the Galactic Council to convene. And when the Council convenes, they'll have to address the larger question your presence represents, which is whether the existing order still serves the galaxy or just serves itself. Brennan processed this and felt pieces clicking together in ways that made uncomfortable sense. So I really am just a political weapon, a way to force a conversation that couldn't happen otherwise. You're a catalyst, the Queen repeated. There's a difference. A weapon is used and discarded. A catalyst creates change and remains part of the new structure that emerges. She stood and moved to the wall display, which showed the nebula outside in its eternal slow dance. 3 months ago, I told the Council I intended to announce constitutional reforms, term limits, redistribution of voting power, representation for minor species. They ignored me. 2 months ago, I submitted formal proposals. They tabled them indefinitely. 1 month ago, I told my closest advisors that I would force the issue through unconventional means, by choosing me at the selection, by choosing someone the system couldn't predict or control, someone whose very presence would make every established faction recalculate their positions. She turned from the display, and for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled without the careful control of royalty. Did you know that within 6 hours of the selection, 17 minor species submitted applications for Council observer status? Applications that had been pending for decades suddenly became urgent because they saw one of the lesser species standing at the center of galactic politics. So the attack tonight, Was the younger factions using the crisis I created to push for the changes their elders won't consider? It's messy and dangerous, and absolutely what I hoped would happen. She moved back to her chair, her expression settling into something more serious. But it's also created genuine risk. The old guard won't surrender power gracefully, and you remain the most visible symbol of change. The next attempt on your life, or mine, may not be theater. Brennan thought about the past weeks, about poisoned food and tampered atmospheric regulators, and ceremonial blades that doubled as weapons. So what happens now? Now we formalize what the selection began. The council convenes tomorrow at Sovereign's Rest, an emergency session they can't avoid given tonight's incident. I'll present the constitutional reforms again, but this time with documentation of every corrupt practice, every suppressed vote, every time they have chosen stability over justice. Her dark eyes held his. And you'll stand beside me, representing everything they fear and everything that needs to change. I'm not qualified to represent anything. You're qualified to be honest, which is rarer than you'd think in galactic politics. She stood, and her elongated ears tilted in a gesture he'd finally learned to read. Determination mixed with something gentler. 3 months from now, when the reforms pass and the galaxy begins the slow work of restructuring itself, there will be a private ceremony, small, attended only by those who have earned the right to be present. On that day, if you're still willing, we'll formalize our union in a way that matters. Not as political theater, but as a partnership between two people who understand that power is a burden best shared. That's possibly the least romantic marriage proposal I've ever heard. Have you heard many? Fair point. Brennan stood, his formal reception garments still subtly shimmering with their protective technology. For what it's worth, Your Majesty, I think you're absolutely terrifying and possibly insane, and definitely the most competent person I've ever met. If you need someone to stand next to you while you dismantle a galactic power structure, I'm apparently available. I appreciate your enthusiasm, Lieutenant. Try to survive the next 3 months. I'd rather not have to explain to the Council that my chosen consort died before we could implement the reforms. It would undermine my credibility. She moved toward the door, then paused. Also, Gary tells me you've been teaching him human jokes. He doesn't understand them, but he's been attempting to tell them to the other guards. Yesterday, he informed Captain Thera that her face was so ugly she turned Medusa to stone. I believe he was trying to be friendly. I may have explained that one poorly. She almost shot him. Please continue. It's the most entertainment the Palace Guard has had in 70 years. Then she was gone, leaving Brennan alone in the interrogation room with the growing realization that he'd somehow agreed to marry the most powerful woman in the galaxy and help her overthrow the political order that had stood for centuries. Gary appeared in the doorway, his granite features impassive. Human Brennan, I have been practicing. Why did the Krell cross the antimatter stream? I don't know, Gary. Why? To get to the other side. The Thalian paused. I do not understand why this is humorous, but you assured me it was a classic. Brennan laughed, surprised by how genuine it sounded. It's perfect, Gary. You nailed it. As they walked back through the palace corridors, past beings who stared with mixtures of curiosity and calculation, past guards who now nodded with something approaching respect, Brennan thought about the selection ceremony that felt like years ago instead of weeks. He'd stood in chains in that amphitheater, expecting nothing, planning for nothing beyond survival. Now he was planning to help reshape galactic civilization, one inappropriate joke and near-death experience at a time. The view from his quarters showed the nebula in its eternal drift, clouds of ionized gas moving through patterns that would outlast empires. Somewhere out there, humanity's colonies were probably still processing the news. Brennan wondered what they'd think, knowing that their failed lieutenant had become a symbol of something larger than himself. Not through merit or intention, but through the simple act of being in the right place when the galaxy needed someone it couldn't predict. He thought about the Queen's tired smile, about constitutional reforms and assassination attempts, about Gary's terrible jokes and Kel's endless briefings, and Captain Thera's reluctant respect. He thought about standing before the Galactic Council tomorrow, representing a species that most considered irrelevant, and demanding they listen. It was absolutely terrifying. It was possibly suicidal. It was, he decided, exactly where he needed to be. 3 months until a quiet ceremony. 3 months to survive politics, assassination attempts, and the slow work of change. 3 months to prove that sometimes the galaxy's most revolutionary choice was the one no one saw coming. He raised his glass, filled with something Kel had assured him was non-lethal, toward the nebula outside. To catalysts, he said to the empty room, and to queens who pick fights with entire civilizations, and to humans who are too stubborn to know when they're in over their heads. The nebula drifted on, indifferent and eternal, while inside Sovereign's Rest, the future began its slow, dangerous, inevitable arrival.